The history of modern Nigeria cannot be fully understood without reflecting on the deep and often tumultuous relationship between labor movements and the state. At the center of this story stands one of the most powerful trade unions in Africa, a body that would prove capable of shaping not only the fortunes of its members, but the trajectory of the entire nation. This union, the Petroleum and Natural Gas Senior Staff Association of Nigeria, commonly referred to as PENGASSAN, has been called by admirers and critics alike the union that broke Nigeria. To understand this, one must step back to consider how oil, labor, and politics became inseparably intertwined, creating a volatile dynamic that would repeatedly challenge the authority of governments, shake economies, and reframe national identity. Nigeria's discovery of crude oil in the mid-20th century transformed the nation's destiny almost overnight. What had once been an agrarian economy dependent on exports of cocoa, ground nuts, and palm oil rapidly shifted into a petroleum-dominated structure. By the 1970s, Nigeria had become Africa's largest oil producer, with revenues fueling rapid urbanization, ambitious infrastructure projects, and the rise of a powerful political class. Yet beneath this surface of wealth, cracks were already visible. Oil wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, corruption became endemic, and economic diversification collapsed as agriculture and local industry were neglected. Within this system, the workers who operated Nigeria's oil infrastructure became essential. Without their expertise, knowledge, and labor, the state's greatest source of revenue could be brought to a halt in a matter of days. It was here that PENGASSAN emerged as both a defender of its members and a force capable of challenging the state itself. Formed in 1978, PENGASSAN represented senior staff and professionals in the petroleum and gas industry. From engineers and geologists to managers and technicians, these were the highly skilled individuals whose work kept the oil rigs, refineries, and pipelines functioning. Unlike some labor organizations that represented unskilled or semi-skilled workers, PENGASSAN's membership wielded technical expertise and occupied positions that made them difficult to replace. This elevated their bargaining power from the very beginning, and successive Nigerian governments soon realized that to anger this union was to risk the lifeblood of the economy. The early years of PENGASSAN coincided with military rule, a time when Nigeria oscillated between periods of authoritarianism and weak attempts at reform. Strikes were often met with repression, union leaders were targeted for intimidation or detention, and yet the petroleum sector was too critical for the government to ignore. When PENGASSAN demanded higher wages, better working conditions, or reforms in policy, their threat to withdraw labor carried more weight than almost any other sector. If Nigerian oil production stopped, the government's revenue collapsed, imports could no longer be financed, and the machinery of the state began to falter. Thus, from its inception, PENGASSAN understood the extraordinary leverage it held. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Nigeria entered a cycle of political instability, economic mismanagement, and mounting debt. Structural adjustment programs imposed by international financial institutions brought austerity, inflation, and widespread hardship. Ordinary Nigerians felt the weight of rising prices, job losses, and declining services, while corruption among the elite appeared to deepen. PENGASSAN, alongside other unions such as the Nigerian Labour Congress and the National Union of Petroleum and Natural Gas Workers, positioned itself as not only an industrial actor, but a political force. Their strikes no longer simply demanded wage increases. They became protests against policies, regimes, and systemic corruption. It was during this era that PENGASSAN acquired its reputation as a union that could bring Nigeria to its knees. Perhaps the most defining period of confrontation came under the dictatorship of General Sani Abacha in the 1990s. Known for his brutality and iron grip, Abacha was not a leader who tolerated dissent. Yet PENGASSAN's opposition became one of the sharpest thorns in his side. When union leaders criticized government policies and corruption, the regime responded with arrests, harassment, and in some cases, targeted killings. The most chilling example was the assassination of PENGASSAN President Frank Kokori's colleagues and the extended imprisonment Kokori himself endured. Despite repression, the union's strikes and resistance exposed cracks in Abacha's regime, demonstrating that even the most repressive state could not entirely suppress organized labor in the petroleum sector. The phrase that PENGASSAN broke. Nigeria is not meant to suggest literal destruction of the nation, but rather to capture the union's ability to halt the machinery of the state and challenge the very structure of governance. Each time oil workers walked off their jobs, the ripple effects spread instantly. Refineries stopped functioning, export terminals slowed, fuel shortages erupted in cities, and prices for basic goods skyrocketed. In a country where over 90% of export revenue depended on oil, the strike of PENGASSAN members represented an existential threat to the government in power. Ordinary Nigerians, although sometimes frustrated by the immediate shortages, often recognized that the union was speaking to larger truths about corruption, mismanagement, and the theft of national wealth. PENGASSAN's confrontations also revealed deeper contradictions in Nigeria's state structure. On one hand, the government relied heavily on oil revenues to fund its operations, but on the other, it attempted to suppress the very workers whose labor made this possible. The oil companies, both international and state-owned, became entangled in these struggles, sometimes siding with the government, sometimes negotiating with the unions. For multinational corporations such as Shell and Chevron, strikes meant billions lost in production, but they also understood that long-term operations in Nigeria required at least some accommodation with organized labor. In the democratic transition of 1999, hopes were high that civilian rule would create a more stable relationship between government, labor, and society. Yet the cycles of strikes and disputes continued. PENGASSAN frequently opposed deregulation of the oil sector, resisted privatization efforts, and criticized fuel subsidy removals that disproportionately harmed the poor. Successive governments under Olusegun Obasanjo, Umaru Musa Yar'Adua, Goodluck Jonathan, and Muhammadu Buhari all faced periods of labor, unrest led in part by PENGASSAN. Each confrontation underscored the reality that Nigeria's reliance on oil created a paradox. The state was simultaneously empowered by oil wealth and constantly vulnerable to those who controlled its production. Beyond economics and politics, PENGASSAN also became a symbol of resistance and a voice for accountability. The union's statements often extended beyond narrow industrial concerns to questions of democracy, transparency, and justice. In doing so, it positioned itself not just as a defender of oil workers, but as a guardian of the Nigerian public interest. This dual role complicated its legacy. To some, PENGASSAN was heroic, a body that stood up to dictators and corrupt politicians when few others dared. To others, it was reckless, willing to paralyze the nation for the sake of its own agenda, exacerbating instability and deepening hardship. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. For the power PENGASSAN wielded was indeed double-edged. The description of the union as the one that broke Nigeria also resonates with the broader history of labor worldwide. In many countries, unions have represented the last line of defense against exploitation, and in some cases, they have catalyzed national transformations. In Poland, the Solidarity movement helped topple communist rule. In South Africa, the Congress of South African Trade Unions played a critical role in ending apartheid. In Nigeria, PENGASSAN and its allies played a comparable role in challenging authoritarianism, confronting corruption, and shaping the contours of democracy. Yet the consequences for Nigeria remain complicated. Strikes often disrupted daily life for ordinary people. Fuel shortages hit hardest in urban centers, where millions relied on affordable transportation and electricity generated by fuel-powered generators. Small businesses collapsed under the weight of high energy costs during prolonged strikes. For a country already grappling with poverty and inequality, the immediate costs of labor unrest were severe. Critics therefore argued that PENGASSAN sometimes harmed the very citizens it sought to defend. This tension between short-term suffering and long-term struggle for justice, defined much of the union's controversial reputation. The legacy of PENGASSAN cannot be confined to the past. In the present day, as Nigeria grapples with energy transition, climate change, and global shifts in oil demand, the role of petroleum unions remains pivotal. Calls to diversify the economy, invest in renewable energy, and reduce dependence on oil confront entrenched interests and powerful lobbies. For PENGASSAN, this raises existential questions. What will be the role of petroleum unions in a post-oil future? Can the union reinvent itself as a champion of broader energy justice, protecting workers while embracing sustainable development? Or will its clout diminish as global demand for crude declines and Nigeria is forced to reorient its economy? What is undeniable is that PENGASSAN has etched itself permanently into Nigeria's history. Its strikes, its confrontations, its martyrs, and its victories form part of the nation's collective memory. It has shown that organized labor can shape the fate of nations, that workers wielding strategic leverage can stand up to governments and corporations, and that in the struggle for justice, no actor can be easily silenced. Whether seen as the union that broke Nigeria or the union that saved Nigeria from itself, PENGASSAN stands as a testament to the power of labor and the fragility of states dependent on a single resource. As Nigeria looks to the future, it must reckon with this legacy. The story of PENGASSAN is not simply one of strikes and shutdowns, but of a deeper truth about power, wealth, and accountability in a society built on oil. It is a reminder that natural resources alone cannot guarantee prosperity, that governance requires fairness and inclusion, and that the voices of workers can and will shape history.